Find a seat. I think we'll get started. It's 10 after. Those sociably late will show up. Hi, Tom. We're going to get started. There are people wandering around Bowdoin lost, trying to find parking, so people will wander in. But we have a lot to cover in 4 hours, so I want to make sure we get started. And good afternoon. Thank you for finding the spot. And on behalf of Penobscot East Resource Center and Maine Farmland Trust, I'd like to welcome you to Land and Sea, an opportunity to take a fresh look at the region's food future. I'm Jody Sapphire, and I will be facilitating the afternoon that we have together. My roles are several, and two of them are pretty simple. The first is that basically your physical needs are taken care of. You can see, you can hear, you have the opportunity to be heard throughout the afternoon, particularly in the second half of the afternoon, that you have water, you know where the bathrooms are, they're in the hallway, first men's, then women's. If any of those issues are a problem, there are people wandering about predominantly who work with Maine Farmland Trust who can help with any of those logistical details. The second job I have is to make sure that we stay on time, and we will. Might be a little squishy in the middle, but we will wrap up this part of the program by 4:30. We'll move across the hall for a reception that we hope you will all stay for and have more casual conversation about the same topics at 4:30 to 5:30 with great local refreshments. The third job that I have, and I think that the planning team as a whole had, was more complicated, and that was to figure out how to help create the conditions for good thinking to occur and for good ideas to be shared. First by several speakers in two different formats, and then in a manner that includes all of you. If you were to look at your name tags for a moment, you will notice that there is something that's not on it, and that is your organizational affiliation. And that was intentional. It was intended as an invitation for you to think as deeply as possible over the next several hours about the future of the region's food production without any responsibility for presenting or representing or advocating on behalf of your organizational home, if you will. It's really not often in our work that we have the opportunity to think simply about how to best safeguard our finite natural resources upon which our food system depends, or think about how to support or create thriving communities where growing or harvesting food is a major activity. Or think about how everyone involved in our food system, regardless of the role they play, can make a livable income without bumping into, well, where does my organization currently fit into all of this, and where should it fit in the future? So this is an afternoon for all of us to have permission not to think about that. Let me quickly but very sincerely thank the members of the Colloquium planning team for working hard to design a program aimed at creating those conditions for good thinking to occur. From Penobscot East Resource Center, both Robin Alden and Patrick Shepard, and from Maine Farmland Trust, John Piatti, Amanda Beal, Ellen Sabina, who had to leave because she's sick, and Megan Quinn. So to start the program off, I'd like to invite Robin Alden and John Piatti to help frame the conversation.
Well, good afternoon. It's so great to see all of you here. As Jody said, I'm Robin Alden. I'm the director of Penobscot East Resource Center, which is Maine's Center for Coastal Fisheries. When I was 21, I started asking questions about fishing. And the more questions I asked, the more I was captivated by the idea that this was an incredible economic engine that provided quality jobs and independence for Maine people, and at the same time, it required, absolutely required, environmental quality. It had to have environmental practices that were effective for its very survival. I was working as a journalist then, and the practice of asking questions that started then brought me here today. In fact, it was my conversation with a clam digger, Herb Carter, that was my first introduction to the kind of intimate ecological knowledge that people who work the flats, fish the bays, or actually work the fields have, and the value of that knowledge to understanding sustainability. So today we've set aside 4 hours to continue to ask questions. Maine is a wonderful place where natural resources are still the underpinning of important segments of our economy. Our land and our water are still, by global standards, remarkably high quality. With the statewide attention to the promise of feeding New England with Maine's agriculture, expanding aquaculture, and real fish restoration, all in a changing climate, Maine has an opportunity to leap over some of the mistakes that have been made in each of those industries and instead innovate. That's why those of us at Penobscot East Resource Center and Maine Farmland Trust thought it would be good to start a conversation, this colloquium, to ask questions and stimulate that innovation. That innovation is within a set of values. I like to say that fishing is a good metaphor for the challenge that we all have for living on planet Earth. With commercial fishing, those thorny questions about living within the bounds of an ecosystem are visible, tangible, undeniable every single day. How do we conduct commercial fishing within the bounds of the marine and connected systems? So that question is no less relevant for agriculture and aquaculture or the broader food system. And then one can take it further. How do we develop a food system that supports adaptation to the ecological change, climate change, that will be affecting our food supplies? And how do we make it all a model of equity? For fishermen and aquaculturists, it's not hard to jump to the importance of thinking about agriculture as well. Simple but true, the ocean is downstream of most human activity. And the fish that swim up the rivers and down again, such as alewives, are integral links between the two systems, cleaning the lakes of excess nutrient while they are in freshwater and feeding predatory fish such as groundfish when they're in the marine system. Herb Carter's son, also a clam digger, is today a vocal and passionate witness to the effects of the land runoff on clam flats. He's equally eloquent and passionate about the effects of commercial intertidal dragging on the productivity and the species mix on the flats. We can't duck these interconnections. We can only benefit by confronting these real consequences of our quest for food. And it's time to link the lessons learned within each of these 3 sectors of the food system. And so today's discussions are designed to make it possible for us all to raise questions that are honest and rigorous. We want those questions to linger in your minds as you go back to work. I have learned that by expanding the circles we run in, sharing our observations, be they of mudflats or farm fields or aquaculture rafts, or the way buying and selling and processing and transporting food is done, that we gain vital insights and valuable additional questions. What is difficult is facing those questions and the implications of what we learn. As these questions reverberate in your work and in Maine's policy making, if we support each other in facing the implications of what we learn, Maine can be a leader in the world. With that, I will hand it over to my good friend, John Piatti.
It's nice to be here. I was sitting, writing a few notes to myself out there when people were beginning to come in, and occasionally I'd look up and see a face. And now standing here and looking out at all of these faces and recognize what this room represents, This is amazing. This is quite an assemblage of people. It really is. Great friends of mine, great partners for some of the work that has occurred in the food system that I've been a part of over the years, and some mentors and guides that have really allowed me to move through my work. So I had to say that at the outset. It just really feels good to be in this room right now. I'm John Piotti. I've worked on farming issues here in Maine for well over 20 years, and for the last 10 years I've done that as the president of Maine Farmland Trust. However, this is my last public event at Maine Farmland Trust. I will be assuming the presidency of an organization called American Farmland Trust, no direct affiliation, but that does similar work. And that begins on October 1st, on Saturday. And my successor at Maine Farmland Trust is Amanda Beal, who we'll be hearing from today. Yes, you can applaud. It's working. It's one of the successes at my time at MFT that she is following me. Like Robin, my connection to these issues is both deep and personal. So in brief, I'm going to tell you my story. I grew up not in a farming family, although we always had a big garden. We put up a lot of vegetables for winter, but I grew up in a fishing family on Nantucket Island. And by the time that I was entering college, my father and my stepfather had passed away, my 4 older sisters had moved off island, and my mother soon joined suit. This was in 1979. That was just before the big transformation that occurred on Nantucket, when summer people began to realize that they could stay a little longer there into the year, first by commuting to New York or Boston, later by telecommuting basically anywhere, and real estate prices started to double every couple of years. I was visiting some friends on the island in a reflective summer between college and graduate school, and I realized at that time, it dawned on me that I could never go home. Not only were there not any real opportunities for me on the island, but I couldn't afford to live there even if there were. It dawned on me that rural places tend to go one of two routes. They either wither on the vine, or they become hip and trendy and overpriced and overbuilt, as my home had become. But either way, there are no opportunities for local people. I moved to Maine a few years later, committed to this idea that I was going to help rural communities grow in ways that would allow local people opportunities to live there and remain there if that's what they wanted. And I found myself working for the Maine Science and Technology Commission, where I first met Robin. One of our first projects was creating the Maine Aquaculture Innovation Center, some 7, 8 years ago now. But I worked with a lot of small firms, many in rural places, trying to rejuvenate local economies. I moved to Unity back when Western Waldo County vied with Washington County as the poorest part of this state. Hard to believe that now, but the numbers were incredibly similar back then. And long before Unity became a center for sustainable agriculture. Back at that period, the poultry industry had died, and there were a few dairy farms holding on by threads. I found myself co-chairing the local comprehensive plan committee with a local dairy farmer, Dick Perkins. And after Dick had sized me up, as farmers will do, and realized I wasn't all that bad, he challenged me. He said, "John, you say you care about rural economic development, but you know absolutely nothing about farming." And he was right. I subscribe to the view that most people did 25 years ago, that farming was our past, and there really wasn't much future in it. But I was big enough to admit what I didn't know and Dick was the first of many people who took me under his wing, and I learned. And what, in essence, I learned through that whole process was that, quite simply, you can't have sustainable rural communities without sustainable agriculture. And I had found my work. 20-plus years later, I still feel that I have an awful lot to learn. Indeed, in some ways, I feel that I have more questions today than I did then. Maybe because I know a little bit more. And with each piece of knowledge I gain, I'm overwhelmed with some of the new complexities or new possibilities that jump out at me. I see our food system, as many of you here do, as a true system. And systems, as we know, are complicated and dynamic. And maybe it's in part because of my background, having grown up on an island, but I also see how what happens on the land as being intrinsically linked to what happens on the sea, under the sea. And that's big. Think about what we're talking about here. We're talking about a profoundly complicated and dynamic system. Basically, our entire ecosystem. A big chunk of our natural resources economy, and the lifeblood of literally hundreds of Maine communities. When we're looking at a single company or a single industry or even a single community, we often try to identify problems to solve. But I don't think problems is the right word when you're talking about a complex system. I'm not even sure solutions is the right way of thinking about it. What we need first is to understand the underlying system, and then to recognize where there are lever points or feedback loops that might be useful as we try to make changes in that system, to change an industry or a community or the environment. Now, our goal today is not to come up with answers, but rather to frame some new questions that help us understand that underlying system. In our planning meetings, we talked about this in an odd way, but we said one of our goals is actually to complicate the picture. We want to encourage all of you to embrace this complex, amazing food system that we have. We want you to be open-minded and holistic in your thinking. Now, this is hard for us humans. We like to jump to conclusions. We like solutions. We like to put things in boxes. And that makes sense because putting things into boxes and summarizing stuff and categorizing things, these techniques are useful, necessary really, often for us to understand things. But the key is to also understand that though that summary might have value, it's never exactly right. And although those trends you're looking at, they might be insightful to look at, they're never more than part of the story. And though the answers that might be running through our mind, they may be wrong. And they're wrong at times because they were just bad, unformed thoughts. And they're probably wrong at other times because what we're talking about defies simple question and answers, problems and solutions kind of an approach. Or to put it another way, all the questions, they don't have simple answers. And some of the questions probably don't have answers at all. And in those cases, what that really means is we have to identify a better underlying question so that we can find an answer. So, our aim today, in summary, is an event that will move us to think about these things in these somewhat different ways. Today's about being open, about being creative, and about being humble. I want to turn it over now to our first speaker. He's a gentleman who is creative and humble. Tim Griffin is one of the leading academics who has taken a systems approach to agriculture. We're really, really lucky to have him right here in New England at Tufts, where he leads a interdisciplinary graduate program in agriculture, food, and the environment, arguably the best program of its kind in the nation. I like to think that Tim doesn't have this broad perspective and this clear eye only because he's a well-established academic, but because of all the years he spent in Maine, which he might mention, or you can read about it in his bio, but we helped train him. But it's great to have you back here with us today.
So I'm going to talk about kind of the agricultural side of the food system, which is where, as John indicated, I've spent a lot of time. My initial faculty position was in Orono, specifically working on sustainable ag issues, and mostly working directly with individual farms or groups of farms. And at that time, that was the only efforts around that in the United States were taking place here in Maine and Orono. So I was very fortunate to have a position like that, and it really brought to bear this idea of thinking about, as both John and Robin indicated, that you have pieces of systems and then you have connections between pieces of the systems, and none of them are simple. So there are no simple answers here, and as John indicated, sometimes we ask the wrong question. So I'm going to spend about the next 15 minutes starting to frame at least the broader food system, and then Bob will follow up after I'm done. So we have multiple purposes. One is to just consider the system, and I'll go through and at least provide some of my perspective on that system and its, as was mentioned, its complexity. And also you'll hear again and again, probably everybody that talks today, thinking about what are these linkages? Do we recognize them at the beginning? Do we know what direction they go? Or are they bidirectional linkages? Are they strong or are they weak linkages? So we'll come back to that again and again. We'll think about drivers of change in this system. There are many. You can probably get it down to a half a dozen or so, at least, categories of drivers. But categories of drivers don't really help us because we need to think about this in concrete terms and sometimes at very local scales and sometimes at larger. It's the scale of New England. It's the scale of the US. And then consequences, and we sometimes when we say consequences, we automatically think that that's negative. It doesn't have to be. There can be positive outcomes or negative outcomes. And thinking maybe more clearly or strategically about what are intentional consequences, and then recognizing this possibility for unintentional consequences, which could also be positive or negative. As was alluded to, we are collectively are not necessarily here to predict the future or chart the future, and I'm certainly not here to fill that role. That's something that we can work on together, and you work on it today, but we continue to work on it when we go back to our individual efforts out there in the world. So there's a lot of ways to look at what has happened in agriculture in the food system in the past, and in some ways we can project into the future, but I would say there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty in doing that right at the moment. This is a kind of a classic USDA graph just showing the changes that we've seen in the number and size of farms over the past 80 or so years, 100 years, where we see a decline in the number of farms, we see an increase in the acreage associated with individual farms. This kind of washes out all of the individuality that's out on farms, however. So you see these kinds of graphs a lot, and it's just, look at this trend and then just continue it. it plays out very differently within different regions of the United States. We also have to recognize that since the peak, which is in about 1935, we produce 5 or 10 times as much output from agriculture on a land base that's actually smaller than it was in 1935. So huge gains in productivity, and we all recognize there are positive things associated with that, and there are negative outcomes associated with that. We think about how land is used. This characterizes land use in the Northeast. This is actually some work that myself and a couple of graduate students and Chris Peters did at Tufts starting about 5 years ago. This would be similar to how you might just look at New England or even the state of Maine, where we still use a pretty substantial land base to produce feed that goes to animals, primarily dairy, but not entirely. Farms control land that's not actually used in agriculture, so small woodlots, those types of things, characterize much of the Northeast, Pennsylvania, New York, all of New England, for example. So that brings it a little closer to what we're talking about today. This was actually Maine's Climate Future was a report that a bunch of us worked on. It was one of the last projects I worked on before I left Orono and moved to Boston, focusing specifically on the potential impacts of climate change on the agriculture sector. And we could put 100 different graphs up here. We're operating in a very uncertain environment in terms of future climate, which influences our capacity to produce certain things and influences both our capacity on land and our capacity in the sea. This just shows changes in growing season. I've been in New England, I'm a newcomer, so to speak, 25 years. And it's startling the changes that have occurred just in the 25 years that I've been here. So this complicates even our being able to look forward and say, what do we want the food system to look like? What kinds of changes are possible? Because this is no longer stationary. So there's a lot of people in the room that work directly in the agricultural sector. That's certainly, as John pointed, that's kind of how I got trained. And I had plenty of farmers size me up also in many different types of operations. And we obviously recognize the central role that farms play in the food system. So that, they are the land-based source of that part of the food supply. And we think of where are they positioned in supply chains, and we often think of them as being kind of the beginning of the supply chain, which isn't quite the case because there's also a lot of things that flow into farms to be able to produce food. So, individual farms, collectives of farms, specific agricultural industries, we all are fairly comfortable thinking about those types of structures. Then you get something like this, which is, if you just like Google image graphic for the food system, you'll get 4 million hits or something like that. It's endless. This particular one I actually like. It was the Institute of Medicine, which is part of the National Academy of Sciences, issued a fairly long report in 2015 specifically on the food system, and their interest was the characteristics of the food system that impact health, obviously, and there are many. So within this, the farms are a piece of this, but then we recognize that this is a system and it has many, many moving parts to it and very dynamic, so the kind of leverage that different parts have changes over time. And the center part, kind of this flow through here, is basically a supply chain where you have material things flowing in one direction and dollars and information essentially flowing in the other direction. But then you have all of these other things that influence the system, that are potential levers that change the system. And you could think of this at different scales if you chose to. If the conversation to here today was specifically to focus on what's the food system of Maine look like, you could start to populate this with specific efforts and specific organizations, maybe actually individuals. So it's a construct, but you could actually kind of pack this with reality. So you have policies, obviously, and I'm going to use the word policy in a somewhat larger sense. It could actually be a policy, but it could be programs that provide incentives. It could be educational programs, things that there's a goal set and you're doing something to achieve that goal, which is certainly what a lot of people in this room do. But there's also markets. There is our ability to grow food within the physical environment that is Maine, for example. There are some things we can grow very well. There are some things that we can't grow at all. Certainly science and technology as in kind of input has had huge ramifications on the system, and then social organizations. So these are the drivers of this system. And again, we can categorize these in very conceptual terms, which might be a good starting point. But at the end of the day, if you want to change the system, you have to be thinking about it in a much more specific way than that. So what are the relationships between these things? How do those supply chains function, whether they're short supply chains or longer, more complicated supply chains? What are the feedbacks in those supply chains? All of those things. But you can develop it so it actually will portray a specific system rather than this, which is just a really well done diagram of a food system. So those are the drivers, and we'll probably come back to those a few times today. So take a random policy, and I intentionally didn't identify one. I want to lay this out a little bit conceptually because one of the things I'm interested in is just how when all of you go do your regular work trying to influence this complicated system, you know, how do you view the role of the decisions that you or your organization makes in doing that? And again, it's sometimes looked at as something that's relatively simple, that if we do this, then this will be the outcome. And it's be quite rare that that's actually the case, right? Because again, there are intended and unintended, and the system is just orders of magnitude more complicated than that. But we could poll the room and say, give us examples of policies or programs that tried to accomplish one of these things from what I'm talking about, the agricultural system. You could increase supply. Maybe that's a specific goal. You want more food produced in the state or in the region. You could actually set a specific goal that you want it 10% more or you want it 50% more, what have you. You could work on the consumer side, which is hard. So I'm in the School of Nutrition, which is kind of an odd place for a sustainable agriculture person to be, but I do get an upfront view with other colleagues of trying to influence consumer behavior, which is very difficult. Or you could focus at the business infrastructure, these supply chains. And we could come up with individual examples from probably everybody in the room that would fit in. Again, these are kind of buckets or boxes. But the complicating factor is that these things are all related to each other. And again, we could probably come up with specific examples of explain to me a program that you know of that was kind of an A to B. If we do this, then that will happen. And then let's talk about whether it was just that single outcome or whether there were multiple outcomes. And some of those multiple outcomes are because these things are all related to each other. Trying to develop policies or programs that influence all of them simultaneously is very, very difficult. It's easier to be narrowly focused than it is to understand the complexity of the system. And that same policy or program could involve kind of different functions, if you will. There are civil society, nonprofit organizations, those kinds of things. There's also government agencies at all scales, from very, very local, agricultural commissions at the town level to USDA, et cetera. You can focus on specific aspects of natural resources. So in my world, my professional world, kind of around agronomy and soil science. I don't know how many presentations I've given in the last 30 years that focus on this piece, that if you treat soil in this way, you get good things happening, and if you treat it in this other way, you get bad things happening. And then all of the various science and technology, which could be applied to agriculture, but it could also be science and technology that's in all of those other pieces of the food system that are outside the gates of farms. So these linkages are important, and this came up in the opening comments a little bit. One of the reasons to recognize they're important is there are many relationships in the food system that have kind of tensions involved in them. And what I mean by that, for this example, so you have farms and then you have consumers, is we could do things that were clearly beneficial to farms that increase their income, that increase their long-term viability or sustainability, that are detrimental to consumers. It's not always a win-win situation. Likewise, as we heard in the opening remarks, things that we do on land influence things that happen in the sea, but also in rivers and lakes and streams. All of the other maybe environments and ecosystems that are outside of those farms. And then we have obviously competing uses for land at every scale. Start at individual farms and just scale up from there to states, to the country. A pictorial example here is you can grow food on it, or you could put solar panels on it and generate energy, renewable energy. But all of these things indicate that there are, these relationships exist. And as I said at the very beginning, thinking about what are those connections, and at least trying to anticipate what some of the other impacts of our decisions may be. And I'll give you an example of that, again, from my experience over the last 30 years or so, thinking about productivity issues on farms is an area that I did a lot of work in extension. I worked at USDA, even some of the work that I'm involved in now. And there are really, if a generic goal is to increase the amount of food that is produced in the state or the region, there are really just 3 pathways by which that can be achieved. So let's use cabbage as an example. So one alternative is you have X number of hundreds or thousands of acres of cabbage, and you don't bring any new fields into cabbage, and you just grow either bigger cabbages or more little cabbages on the same acreage. We've done this in crops and livestock pretty consistently since 1945. Where the milk output from dairy cattle is now 4 or 5 times what it would have been then. So our ability to achieve this just by increasing yields is pretty substantial. The open question would be, can we keep that line going up at the same rate that it's been going up for 6 decades, which is a pretty good task. Another way to do this, maybe the next most likely way, because I think this first one is usually the first step, let's just increase productivity, is you could say, we have a goal of having more cabbage, and the way we're going to do that is we're going to have less of something else. So we have the same amount of cropland, and we're essentially changing the mix. And there would be some programs and policies out there that would have as a pretty explicit goal that this is what it would be, even at the national level. So you'll hear comments like, we should just, in really productive areas, grow more fruits and vegetables and grow less corn and soybeans, right? So it's still a zero-sum game in terms of the land use in those situations. And the other one is you could convert land. So you could take land that's currently not being used for crop production, and you could bring it into agriculture. So all of these have consequences on individual farms. They have consequences in terms of the set of products that multiple farms produce, and they have consequences on the broader environment. including just being able to increase yield. That's not an activity or a goal that comes with no impacts whatsoever. Many of the environmental impacts of agriculture, broadly defined in the US, are a result of our setting a goal to increase per acre or per animal productivity, and then actually achieving the goal. But it's all of the other things that go along with that. So this idea of consequences and trade-offs, and trying to at least identify some situations where it's not a zero-sum game, it's what you might call a mutual gain, that we could have things that benefit farms and benefit consumers at the same time. So I'm going to end by just going back to this picture, just so that we're all thinking about a system as we go forward. And what we'll do through the course of the afternoon then is try to start to think about where do our goals kind of fit in here, and what do you, the types of work that all of you do, where does that work fit into something like this? And it's really the first step in an ongoing conversation. So with that, I'm going to stop, and I will introduce our next speaker from the University of Maine. Or is Robin going to do that? Okay. Very good. Thank you.
So I have the pleasure of introducing Bob Stenek. He's a professor at the University of Maine. Fitting for today, he's an ecologist. He thinks of things in systems and complexity. I first met him in the 70s when he was a lobster scientist who was really notable because he was breaking the mold. He was doing things like talking to fishermen and riding on their boats. And so his career has gone on. He's got a global reputation both in the fisheries of the Gulf of Maine and also in the coral reef world. He's a Pew Fellow, a AAAS Fellow, and he's going to take us on a lightning tour of the Gulf of Maine.
Thank you. All right, well, I have to do a little technical adjustment here. Let's see if we can get this. There we go. Thank you. Yeah, no, it's really it's just great to be here. At my age, it's really great to be anywhere. Yeah, I'm going to, first of all, see if we get this computer to work with us. That's the last couple of papers I was working on. Okay. All right, so I decided to call this Maine's first hunters and gatherers to farmers, our deep marine roots. And it occurred to me that really fishing is just like farming, just with a few exceptions. If you're a fisherman, you have a bigger field. You don't plant anything. You never add water. You don't add nutrients. But it's a common property, so your crop can be harvested by your neighbor or folks from another state. But other than that, it's exactly like farming. And the North Atlantic is actually pretty unique for a whole bunch of reasons. It's a very young ocean, and it's young and it's only been cold for a short period of time. It was inoculated from the North Pacific, but it was an incomplete inoculation. We only got a handful of species. And then we have these pesky glaciers every 120,000 years coming down, creating massive extinctions in the western North Atlantic. And it leaves us with remarkably low species diversity, about the lowest diversity of any such ecosystem in the world. And yet it's highly productive. And so this is a system that tends to be prone to booms and busts. And I think you know about some, you'll hear about some more as I talk about the western North Atlantic. So, obviously this is just the tip of the iceberg, but I'd like to get into briefly what was natural. The peopling of the watershed, I'd like to make this connection between the land and the sea, the dam problem. The evolution of fishing technology and practices and ecosystem impacts, and really now the climate challenges and opportunities we have now and for tomorrow. So if we think about what was natural, I'd really like to start off thinking a little bit about Penobscot Bay as a case study, but it turns out that some of the earliest inhabitants that came to the coast of Maine, probably before 10,000 years ago, but the record is good about 5,000 years ago. And we have places like on North Haven Island. It's called the Turner Farm. And Turner Farm is the best studied archaeological site on the coast of Maine. And in that archaeological site, you find fish hooks carved out of deer bone that age about 5,000 years ago. You get cod vertebra that are about 4,000 years ago, and that's a centimeter scale. That's one honker big codfish. And so we know that we had these guys around, and if you look at I do some dumpster diving. You go into the Indian Middens and you look at the fragments, and you find that the most abundant fragment is cod bones, and there's flounder. You get swordfish, you get sturgeon. It's a really interesting thing. You learn a couple things. These folks loved seafood. Interesting, there's no lobsters, and there's no crabs in any of the middens in the western North Atlantic. And I'll get back to why I think that might be true. But what happened in Maine is, we really had some of the early colonization in this area, and the role of rivers and dams is a really interesting story. If you just think about this ecosystem, if we're thinking about the coast of Maine, you should be thinking about the entire watershed. And when you do that, you see the footprint is big, and it covers much of the state of Maine. We've got a lot of well-known species, including Atlantic salmon, that are anadromous. They grow up and get big and reproductive in the ocean, and then they go up to reproduce and have their young up in our estuaries. One of the things that people don't think about much are the nutrients that actually come with these guys up into our otherwise oligotrophic or nutrient-poor waters. And so you can think of it this way. You've got these marine nutrients, and you have the nutrients coming up into the nursery streams, and that's where the young are growing up. And as a matter of fact, this is a published study that shows the young that grow up where there's high marine nutrients are actually larger, and then they flow out. And so, this kind of thing made me think of this as a circulatory system, which is very interesting. So my human health analogy would be, this is your classic story of your circulatory system, and when you get to be my age, you worry about these things like blocked arteries, and these are things you really want to avoid. So if you look at this watershed and you think about how it's changed over time, this is a reconstruction of all of the tributaries, and it really does look like a good circulatory system. But these little black dots, and those are from 1630 to 1750, those black dots are dams. And if you think about the dams as a way to block those arteries, and you think about the Penobscot, that's a distribution of dams in 1790. And if you also think about how the peopling of Maine occurred, and we just simply subdivide this in terms of Upper Penobscot River, Lower Penobscot River, and Penobscot Bay, and you start in the 1790s, what you see is you already have dams, but the peopling beginning on the coast in a very big way. But look at the dams on the left as they're accumulating in the state of Maine. It's really an amazing infestation of dams. And, you see a big slug of people in Lower Penobscot Bay back when the schooners were getting very active. But this is a serious situation. As a matter of fact, if you actually work it out and you look at the number of dams, the cumulative number of dams over time, it's basically 202 dams in 210 years, about a dam a year for 2 centuries. And the impacts, you can do these kind of correlations, but you see things like remarkable declines in Atlantic salmon. But there are other river runners in Maine. And if you put them all together, that is the shad and the alewives. These are things that also run up these rivers. You see this increase in terms of landings per town, peaking in the early 1800s. And then you see this decline. Interestingly, the Penobscot head tide dam occurred about there. And there was a significant collapse after that. And this is all of these diadromous species. And this has actually continued but it's very important to note that these are forage fish. They are arguably the food base for things like groundfish. So you actually have two ends of this ecosystem that are affected by these dams. And if you take the human health analogy, and what's the doctor going to say? You have the cumulative impacts of blocked arteries. And what we can do about that is what's now known as the Penobscot River Restoration. And the interesting thing is it does look to be working. The most recent evidence is that the number of new alewives are measured in the millions. And this is interesting. We really don't know what the impact is. It's a fascinating experiment. But this is the forage for possibly the next generation of groundfish. But if you think about that, that's the kind of the addition of food. But what about subtraction? If you take a look at this case study and you subdivide it by the upriver down to the lower bay, and you just look at the landings, you see these booms and busts beginning in the rivers, and it's a sequential extirpation going down these the estuary to the outer bay. And when you get to the outer coast, now you're talking about coastal extirpations from fishing, but these fishing boats were leaving from Penobscot Bay and other places and going out to places like Nova Scotia. So what you end up having is this ever-increasing fishing capacity. That is, you go from sailing vessels to steam vessels, you develop purse seines, you have increased capacity to refrigerate your product and improve transportation, and these kind of things can actually have a big impact. If you look at all the landed weight in this Penobscot region, a number of species now are included, you see the improved fishing gear increasing landings, but only to a point, and then you start seeing, with the purse seines, refrigeration, and transportation, you start seeing the landings declining. And then you'll see this jump up, and this really includes the larger vessels that are fishing from Penobscot Bay, and now some of the big tonnage being things like herring, redfish, and lobsters. So we have something on the order of 5,000 years of fishing on the coast of Maine, and it's a fascinating story. If you go back to the World Authority on Lobsters in the 1800s, and he published his work in 1909, he was basically saying that codfish was probably the most destructive enemy of the lobster. He was observing lobsters inside the guts of a lot of cod at the time. We know that cod is big. It's a trophic generalist. It feeds on fish when they're adults, but they feed on ducks, and you find rocks in their stomach. They're kind of they're not a picky eater, apparently. But if you look at their abundance over the entire period of time, we've got trawl data, and then you start breaking it down by decade, you'll see that in the 1970s, there was a pretty good coastal and Georges Bank population of cod. This was breaking up in the 1980s, in the 1990s breaking up even further. And by the 2000s, you could say that really we largely have a predator-free zone on the coast of Maine. I think this is a beginning of a significant domestication of our coastline. I was able to do some work offshore, a place called Cassius Ledge, and out there was relic populations of predatory fish. And when I was working out there, I was tethering lobsters on patio blocks. I did the same thing in coastal zones, but those are mostly pollock that you see there, but we saw big cod, we saw cusk, wolffish, and the yellow camera there are video cameras, and this was at about 110 feet. And what we were able to do is we wanted to look at if you just simply tether lobsters in this area that has abundant groundfish, what happens to the lobsters? About 75% of all the lobsters we tethered out there were consumed within 24 hours. And as a matter of fact, we lost 5 of those patio blocks. So you can make the case that this ecosystem has fundamentally changed in favor of the lobster. And when you think about this, and we go back to the case study of Penobscot Bay, in 1880, the inflation-corrected value was around $19 million. Compared to today, in that area, we're talking about over $300 million. But when you look at the distribution of species that were part of that, it's a really different story. In 1880, 24% was lobsters, and now it's about 92% lobsters. So, you could think, well, lobsters are valuable, so this should be a success story. But you have to think about these larger socioeconomic pictures. And I liken this to a gilded trap. It looks attractive, it's golden, but it's not solid gold because lobstering technology has improved, but the stocks have not declined. And front page article in the New York Times in 2001 talks about lobsters in Maine are booming. 2012, they say there's more lobsters than we know what to do with. This is what the lobster landings and value in Maine have done in the last several decades, reaching $500 million last year. But is it a good idea to be so dependent on one species? How many farmers in the room would be really happy if you just had one type of vegetable, and that's what you base your entire income on? And on top of that, we have these challenges of a changing environment. We know that, that the globe is warming up, and there's a lot of climate effects. The northern hemisphere, and especially in the Gulf of Maine, it's warming faster than a lot of places. And if you look at the Boothbay Harbor sea surface data that they've been collecting since 1905, the trend is pretty obvious. What happens is that things like lobsters that are valuable to us, they have a cold temperature below which they will not settle to the seafloor. And then there's this area where they're settling, and that's their sweet spot, but then there's temperatures that are too warm. So if you look at the coast of Maine, there are regions that are a little bit too cold, there are regions that are a little bit too warm, but currently we are in a sweet spot, and that's great, and that's why, in fact, we're doing so well with lobsters. But if you look at the diversity of what we're harvesting, and that's what's in black, and then the percentage that's lobsters, that's what's in blue, from 1950, you see a relatively flat line. When we developed the exclusive economic zone and globalized markets, we saw the diversity of things we harvested on the coast of Maine go up. The lobsters were holding constant. And then you saw the diversity of what we could harvest sustainably drop, and we saw lobsters explode. And that is the lucrative monoculture that we have today. So as far as we can see, we have lobster traps. We have 6,000 men depending upon, or women and dogs and all kinds of folks are dependent upon on lobsters. And my concern is that this is somewhat of a domesticated ecosystem. We removed the predators. Arguably, we are feeding these guys. And the question is whether this is a socio-economic time bomb. As temperatures warm, some things are getting better for lobsters. In Long Island Sound, it was looking great till 1998, which was the warmest year on the planet. But it triggered a disease, a shell disease, that was lethal, and 80% of the population crashed. And they have not recovered. And that surprised everyone. And we really don't like surprises in fisheries management. And so the question is, are we looking at a future where we're going to be seeing the warming areas increase, we're seeing the cooling areas decline, and are we really seeing Maine's sweet spot leaving us? There have been studies done that are suggesting with warmer temperatures, and we're expecting in the Gulf of Maine something on the order of 2 to 4 degree warmer temperatures. If we look at the predicted landings at 1 degree warmer temperature, what we consider a declining population is close to the Gulf of Maine. As we go to 2 degrees, you can see it's obviously moving farther and farther north. And there are people who totally disagree with this idea, but we do worry about how temperatures are actually shifting the species that we have. And so northern shifts are expected, and there is evidence. This is red hake that has significantly increased since the 1960s, and everybody agrees that's due to temperature. Warming temperatures brought the red hake in, and that's a good resource. Other shifts, black sea bass, a terrific food fish. And the lobstermen are seeing a lot more of these. And what was formerly a distribution that you found in the mid-Atlantic states is now being found in abundance in Maine. And as a matter of fact, DMR is quantifying the take of black sea bass now. And there are more species coming. We know that in 2012 we had the ocean heat wave. The red colors there is a temperature anomaly that stretched from North Carolina to Greenland. It was remarkable. And it fed into this increase that we've seen in the last 10 years in the Gulf of Maine. Some people say we're warming faster than 99% of the world's oceans. The thing that's interesting about the 2012 heat wave is that I got telephone calls from fishermen asking me what was going on. And I said, what do you mean? He said, it's April and lobsters are shedding. And so I called some physical oceanographers. They didn't know anything was going on at the time. The fishermen were also the first to adapt to this. They were fishing in different places. Other ground fishermen started seeing squid coming in. They adapted to that. This is really interesting, and I think it points to the fact that we have to really reinvent fisheries management so fishermen can become better stewards of their fishing grounds. After all, sustainability is job security for these harvesters. And really, if you look at this, this is from Maine GIS, and it's commercial fishing dependence on the coast of Maine. You can see there are areas, especially in eastern Maine, where this is hugely important. And so my conclusions include that Maine's maritime heritage depends on the sustainability of its marine resources. People have changed the watershed, but are working now to restore it. Natural resources are rapidly changing in dynamic and sometimes surprising ways. These changes are first observed by the local fishing communities, and so I think the challenge will be to find ways to get the local management dynamics and the ecosystem to line up so that we can actually be managing at the scale that the fishermen are observing things. And if they do that, then there's some hope that these Maine hunters and gatherers will actually transit to become more like real farmers. So I told you I was just covering the tip of the iceberg. It's just a complex ecosystem. I've touched on warming, but there's other difficult problems such as pollution, sea level rise, ocean acidification, invasive species. Ask me about it later. But several of these points I think will be discussed as we go on through this. And so with that, I thank you all. Do you want me to unplug? Just close this.
You can just close it. That's fine. Oh, it's my pleasure now to introduce Amanda Beal. As I mentioned earlier, Amanda is my successor at Maine Farmland Trust. She's known to many of you. She's a truly unique person in that she has spanned these two worlds of farming and fisheries, perhaps as well as anyone I know. She grew up herself on a dairy farm. Her husband is a seafood broker, and she has, from an academic perspective, really looked at the overall system. Many of you are familiar with the New England Food Vision, a great document that really put in place a lot of the thinking that has been unfolding in New England around food system issues. And Amanda is personally responsible for going to the group that was then the set of authors and say, you're not looking at the seaside of this as comprehensively as you should be. And she became then part of the team and helped advance that document to what it became. At Maine Farmland Trust, we're just incredibly pleased that she agreed to join our staff about 18 months ago. And I won't go into the detail of some of the very fascinating cutting-edge work that she and I have been exploring around farmland reclamation and doing that in the right way. But she then recently took on a job as our vice president, and then just about 6 weeks ago, our board appointed her to be my successor. I cannot be more happy. When you've been working with an organization as I have with Maine Farmland Trust, I helped found it 17 years ago. I've run it as their CEO for the last 10 plus years. Nothing makes you feel better than knowing that the organization is going to be in good hands. And with Amanda, it's going to be in very good hands, and I see its future soaring to new heights. So with that, Amanda Beal.
Excuse me for just a minute. We're having, the battle of the Macs and the PCs, so we have to switch up. I trust that it will come up. Here we go. Thank you very much, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. It's always great to listen to Tim, who was one of my favorite professors when I was doing my master's at Tufts, and I always enjoy listening to Bob, and I always learn a lot. So I'm sure we all did in this room, even in that brief, but those very packed presentations. So what I'm going to do right now is try to take a little bit of a closer look at some of Maine's production data. And John mentioned it in the opening. He was talking about data trends, and I've noticed this. There are certain data trends that get a lot of attention, and they're exciting, maybe because they're very positive or they're very negative, but sometimes it's a good idea to really look under the hood to get a better sense of what's going on. So that's what we're going to do here for the next few minutes, is just dive in a few areas. I'm not going to try to cover too much, because I'm really looking forward to the part of this day where we have a bigger discussion, and I'm excited to get to that. So, like I said, I'm going to focus on production data because that's where my head has been at a lot recently. But we could have had somebody up here talking, and sort of pulling apart data related to hunger or finance or labor, and there would have been some good things to learn there. And I think that just says that there's a lot more that we can discuss today and in the future. And like Tim said, we're not here to try to pose any answers. I have a bunch of questions in my slideshow here, and I'm hoping we can get back to those also as a group. So just things to think about up front. We have a number of reasons to be excited about the potential to produce more food here in Maine. There have been a number of great reports that have come out recently, good analysis that expand on that potential, that really point us to certain places where we could be doing more. It's also important to understand the limits of what we are and what we are not able to measure. So when we look at data, we know it's not perfect. Sometimes it's really hard to access good data, and that's just the reality. But sometimes we have to work with what we have. But it's always good to remember we might not know the whole story with what we're looking at. And the third thing that I just wanted to put forward is this idea that, if we can view the whole system, we have a much better chance of avoiding making trade-offs unintentionally, and we can increase the positive potential of our collective efforts. So I'm going to talk about some things that we know, and I've clipped this information from the New England Food Vision only because it's really handy to me, and I know that there is a good amount of research that was behind it. So just to ground us, about 90% of the food that we consume in New England comes from somewhere else. And if we were thinking about how we feed the current population of 14.5 million people, it requires about 16 million acres, which is more than 1 acre per person. So a few more things we know. We do have the potential to produce a lot more food in New England, and we have the potential to produce a lot more food in Maine. And when I talk to groups in other places, talk about the New England Food Vision, when they see this map of New England, it's really hard not to have your eyes wander to the great state of Maine, and knowing that we have a lot of land, a lot of productive water, and that we have a lower population density than some of the southern New England states. Maine is on the radar. And so I remember something that Mark Lapping from the University of Southern Maine used to say often, which is, and he was one of the co-authors of the vision, which is that it's really great to think about wanting to produce more food in Maine, but what we don't want to be is the raw materials provider for the value-added piece to happen elsewhere. We want to make sure that we're also thinking about that piece when we're thinking about scaling up production. And so, as you've heard a lot today, I don't think I really need to repeat it, but managing our natural resource base is pretty important to how well we can move into the future with more food production, and doing it in a way that is going to be sustainable for the long term. And I think that Bob and Tim have covered that quite well today. So just digging in here, this is Ag Census data. This represents the number of farms in 2012 to 2000, or from 2002 to 2012, and land-in farms from 2002 to 2012. And when you see this graph, it gets exciting. And a lot of times people are talking about, we have had this, boom, this increase in number of farms and land-in farms. And when you're looking at a 10-year spread like this, a 10-year time scale, it is quite exciting. I want to just kind of pull apart, I should say, I have, some people in the room will recognize some of the graphs that I've used because there are so many good reports and good analysis out there that I was able to borrow some nice graphics from other places. So American Farmland Trust did a really great report project not too long ago, released earlier this year, called Gaining Insights, Gaining Access. And they did a nice analysis here looking at the trends of land-in farms. So we could see that there was an increase overall in land-in farms. And what you can't see, I'm sorry, at the back, I'll explain it, is that when you break it down and look at the cropland, pasture, and woodland components of that land-in farms number, what's been happening over the last 10 years is we're actually seeing we've seen sort of a decrease, well, from 2007 to 2012 in cropland, and we're seeing an increase in woodland. So that's an interesting trajectory, and it might not match up with what we think is happening. Do we know why that's happening? Probably not. Will it look different in the next ag census? I think it will. But it's just good to be looking at this and understanding sort of what's under the hood. So this is actually a much longer time scale look at those same numbers. And so you can see way back in 1910, the number of farms was way up here in about the 60,000 farm, at the 60,000 farm level. And by 2012, here we are at around 8,174. That's quite a steep drop. And then again, you see this very steep drop in the land-in farms over that period of time. What becomes almost imperceptible when you look at a long time scale like that is the exciting uptick in the number of farms and land-in farms that we've seen in the last 10 years. So I think we just have to ground ourselves in this and say, it's exciting, but is everything that we're doing enough? Are we going to continue going upward? Or, is there a lot more that we need to be thinking about if we're really going to move things forward in a direction that we want to go to? Just incidentally, I'll say that in the New England Food Vision, we talked about the potential for New England to move toward producing about 50% of the food that we consume. And that would have us right around the 1959 levels, which is why I included that. That gives you a sense of, 50 years from now, if we really put our minds to it, there's the potential that we could get there, but it's not a given. The story is not written yet, and we have to really, I think, be diligent and thoughtful and strategic about how we move forward. So this is another thing that I just wanted to point out. So the blue line is gross farm income, and the green line underneath it are production expenses. So they track pretty well together, particularly in the last 10, 20 years. And then the third line, the orange one at the bottom, is actually net farm income. So when you look at the very end of that graph, you can see that what's been happening in this last stretch, while we've been really excited about the increase in the number of farms and the increase in land and production, is that net farm income is going down. And that could be an indicator that we have a problem. It could be that we just need to work harder to understand what's going on there. This is another couple of graphics from the American Farmland Trust Gaining Insights and Gaining Access project. So looking a little bit more deeply even, the first graphic talks about principal farm operator ages. And what you can see if you're closer is that the sort of age 45 to 54 category of farm operators has been decreasing in this last 10-year stretch. And in the next graph, it shows that beginning farmers It's older beginning farmers have higher sales but negative net farm income. So it's showing that people who are coming into farming in a 45 age plus, they actually are not doing so well. Could that be why we're seeing this sort of shrinkage in that category? We don't necessarily know. I think we need more information. Looking at fisheries, this is just sort of some baseline information, although it was from about a year ago and probably these numbers have changed. About 5,300 miles of coastline when you count all the islands, mainland and islands, around 5,000 commercial fishermen, about 90 companies operating 180 aquaculture farms employing approximately 600 people. And again, I think Bob had a slide that showed that's even better, but you know, when you look at the main commercial landings, this is from 1964 to 2014, it kind of seems like everything's heading in the right direction overall, give or take a few dips. But then when you dig into it, you can see that really the majority of that upswing and the increase in value has been lobster. And also, you know, Bob covered this well, but there are accounts of people coming to the new world and actually saying that there was so much cod that it got in the way of them trying to sail their ships. So it is a very different ocean and a different Gulf of Maine than what we see today. But I think it also speaks to a couple of things. One, that there is the potential for it to be a highly productive environment. Also, that, well, I'll bring up my last point here, that the Gulf of Maine has changed a lot over time, and it will continue to change. And partly because we have intervened in its process, but also because it is a changing environment. So the other thing to think about with lobster, many rural coastal towns now depend almost entirely on lobsterings to support their local economy. So here are some questions, just to be thinking about. Maybe we'll come back to them a little bit later. But how do we best support ecological diversity and richness in our waters? And how do we manage competing uses? And when I say competing uses, I mean both agriculture and fisheries. So I'm involved in a lot of conversations about land and farmland conservation. And sometimes I look around at what other people are thinking about, and I know that there are folks who are thinking about forestry and other types of conservation, recreation, development, and we're all talking about the same land. So at some point, we kind of have to reconcile that. And in terms of fisheries, you know, there's transportation and recreation and energy generation, and even at times aquaculture and agriculture that become competing uses. So we really need to talk about that. We really need to think about that. So I'm going to do a little comparison of dairy and lobsters. And in my mind, this makes complete sense for a few reasons. But first, I was going to ask if anybody knew what kind of a cow that was, except for Rick Kurzbergen. You're not allowed to answer this question. Anybody? No? Good shot, though. It's a milking shorthorn. So anyway, the similarities between dairy and lobsters, they are both commodities that contribute greatly to our state economy. Most of the processing at this point happens outside of Maine. The economics of both are really tricky. They're very perishable items. It's very hard to project supply and demand, and once you have them, you've got to move them. So that can result in a lot of sort of roller coaster activity around the economics of dairy and lobsters. And both have sort of an indeterminate future. And if we were to lose either or see a sharp decline in either, it could have a really huge impact on rural economies and our lives. And also, I would say it would take a really big chunk out of our idea that we could produce more food and feed ourselves, because they are really important at this point in time. So I want to look a little bit more closely at Maine dairy. because I think this is something that gets lost in the excitement of the increasing number of farms, and that we're moving forward and we're moving in this direction, everything's going strong. So something about dairy to understand, they're an anchor for some of the types of other services that other farms require, large animal vets and machinery dealers and equipment repair people and things like that, mechanics. They're very large holders of working farmland. And we're continuing to see the loss of mid-sized commercial dairy farms. And even if you look at the Ag Census numbers of total dairy farms, you don't see it. And that's why, again, this is often lost in translation, because we have seen an increase in the small sort of micro dairy sector. But when you look at those sort of 20 to 99 head dairy farms, which is really it's the backbone of our commercial dairy industry in Maine, we are seeing a continued decline. And so part of that, it's goes back to that roller coaster economics piece, where sometimes net income and cost of production are going in totally different directions, and it makes them very vulnerable. There's a really high cost of infrastructure, so that's a barrier for entry for new farmers. And as I talked about, the visibility is just masked by a number of factors. And so the question I pose is, what is the tipping point? If we continue to lose these dairy farms, and we know that they're an important anchor and they're important to our economy, and they hold all of this working land, what is the tipping point before other sectors of agriculture really feel this? Similarly, lobsters. At this point, because of the volume of lobster that we're harvesting, they also serve as sort of an anchor for other services, for other fisheries. There's a controlled entry, which for some people feels like a barrier, but it's also really important for the management of lobsters, of the fishery. And I just wanted to point out that, that controlled entry is a lot like, it is the sort of gateway to production. It's a lot like farmland access for agriculture. So there's definitely a parallel there. Again, you have some of those roller coaster economics where things aren't always going in the same direction. There's seasonal uncertainty. Even more recently, there have been a lot of questions about sort of the moving target of when are we going to have the high peak of the season, the high period. Changing markets. So this table actually only goes to 2014, and we all know that the last few years we've had a lot of success in marketing lobsters internationally. This year, the FAO said that's probably going to be heading in the other direction at some point in the not too distant future. And are they right? Are they wrong? I don't know. We'll find out. And again, what's the tipping point? So a little bit more to think about before I step aside here. But just to hold in your mind, it's not all gloom and doom. Our marine environment actually has the ability to be highly productive, even in the face of change. We've seen it. We do have the capacity to grow much more food on land through agricultural production, but we really need to keep an eye on the whole system to avoid making unintentional trade-offs and to increase the positive potential of our collective efforts. And that realizing the highest potential of Maine's food-producing future is not a given. There are known and unknown challenges, and we are going to need to be adaptive. We need to actively share knowledge across our areas of expertise, and we have to keep working strategically together. So that's why I'm glad we're all here.
Thank you all. Lots to think about. We're going to spend the next half hour in a small conversation and as witnesses to it with John and Amanda John and Robin framing up some questions for the three speakers that start tackling we ended up with this laundry list of questions that we really wanted everyone to be thinking about collectively. So they're just going to start, again, at the tip of the iceberg, and then after a break, you will all have the opportunity to do that as well. So, John, Robin.
To you all. And so some of these questions that John and I will be posing to these three people, we don't expect them to have to answer them, as we said, only to start the discussion. And we actually hope that these are some of the themes that may come back in our broader conversation later. So I wanted to start out by saying that I think this issue of uncertainty that we have all been talking about, and also the issue about how much we've learned about the interrelationship of all of these, of land use to water quality to marine systems. I, as a non-farming person, I never knew that what every farmer knows, which is that one part of his field or property has soil that has one characteristic and the other corner has another one. And that's a kind of a micro understanding that farmers have been using to their advantage for a long time, or trying to overcome with various inputs and whatever. We don't have, I guess what I would pose is that maybe admitting that we really aren't sure about all of these interactions could lead us to some different approaches. And my question for you is, how can we not be paralyzed? So when we don't know the ecological function of a certain area that's being investigated as an aquaculture lease, and we don't know the consequences of putting a predatory fish pen there, or taking all the plankton out of the water because you've got a big shellfish farm there, how do we make decisions that acknowledges our need for ongoing learning? And I guess then I'll just say, given that we also have now an understanding that that everything changes, so that even if we understand something, it may not be true in the future.
Jump in.
Well, the idea that we raised a lot of issues around uncertainty in our talks, guaranteed that we did that. And then one outcome of that is exactly what you would describe, which is, given that amount of uncertainty, how do we do anything? Or, how do we not become totally cynical? I'm an optimist from top to bottom, so it may be a challenge. But there are a lot of things that we know, and I'll talk more from the agriculture side, and maybe Bob, you can talk from the marine side. There are a lot of things that we do know. So if you look at, for example, improving environmental outcomes associated with agriculture, there's not that much uncertainty there. I mean, we know what practices and systems have specific positive outcomes, and we know what practices and systems have negative outcomes. One of the differences that I see between the agriculture, the land-based agriculture, and some of the marine issues is that the way that the natural resource base is controlled is quite different between the two of them. So when we work with farmers, and those, it's very much property right based, and in this country, at all levels of control, we've been very reluctant to force farms to behave in a certain way in terms of production practices and systems. There have been only a very few instances where at the federal level they've come up to that line in the sand, so to speak, to where they thought they might force farmers to have certain conservation practices, for example. And at the federal level, they've largely backed away. Now, it doesn't mean that there aren't levers that would encourage farmers, but their participation in programs is still voluntary, largely. The few exceptions to that are actually those places where agricultural land use has influenced marine environments. So in this part of the country, the best example is probably the Chesapeake Bay. In the middle of the country, it's the Mississippi River basin, which is gigantic. But even in those instances, there are some elements put in place that farmers have to do certain things. But in most instances, it doesn't come down to you have to do this. But that doesn't mean we don't understand what needs to be done. So this idea of how do we get there, if we insist that it's going to be in kind of USDA speak, voluntary and incentive-based, how do we have more success than we've had up to this point? There have been successes. This is not a situation where it's a total failure. But we also clearly recognize that we have a ways to go, whether we're talking about environmental sustainability from agriculture or economic or social sustainability. So those are the types of things that collectively all of us can contribute. But it is a daunting task to even think about how do you make progress. One way you make progress is, you don't think about what it looks like at the level of the entire United States, because it's not going to fit every place. This particular strategies will work better in some places than others.
Yeah, I'd like to add some good friends of mine, probably known by a lot of people in the room, Rob and Jan from the Goranson farm. And, it's just amazing watching them year after year when the weather is throwing all kinds of curveballs, whether it's a dry year or a wet year when they're planting. And I asked Rob, well, how do you do it? And he just said, diversity. He said, I never can predict at the beginning of the season what's going to be our good money maker this year. So I just have as many different things out there as possible. And what's interesting here is that in the marine realm, if you talk to the old timers, and people my age and older, they talk about when they used to fish, and they would fish only one season for lobsters, and they would go for groundfish, they would go for scallops. They had a lot of diversity, and they had licenses for each one of those things. And see, the difference here is that you're dealing with a common property, so you actually have to be licensed for every species. Well, with the rise of lobsters, and everybody wants to become a lobsterman, there has to be a limited entry. The people who are doing well with lobsters, many of them only have licenses for lobsters. And so when you start thinking about this and you want to see more biodiversity, you want to see diversity in the Gulf of Maine so that you can do what Rob and Jan do, and you can go for the resource that happens to be up this year or this decade. They can't do that. They have silos. The people in the ground fishing, they have federal permits for ground fishing. They can't go for lobsters. When things change, there are management constraints about following that change. This is not a simple thing to deal with, but it's an important one for us to be talking about, I think. And I think that at the management level, there's this concept called adaptive management, where you have a management plan and you should revisit it and change it later on if things don't work out. In fact, the number of times those things are really changed are as rare as hen's teeth. And so we really do need to see flexibility both at the management level and I think at the harvester level to deal with this kind of uncertainty.
I was going to say something similar, and it was in my slideshow too, about needing flexibility, whether it's around management strategies or policies or funding requirements, pretty much across the board. I think that we see a lot in agriculture also that there are really well-intentioned programs that end up tying farmers' hands. They can't make quick changes when they really need to. And then the other thing that I would say is really important when we're talking about this, I think, is that we need to be thinking about how do we evaluate what we're doing using lots of different kinds of knowledge, not just academic knowledge, but the knowledge of people, fishermen on the water and farmers on the land. They see things sometimes at a finer and a quicker scale than, our ag census data is, by the time we get it, it's already old. And then we're waiting for the next batch. So I think that those two things are really, really important.
I had a couple questions in my mind, but hearing Bob's comments about first crop diversity and then species diversities. I'm going to go down this track. So in addition to those kind of diversities, and whenever anyone hears me talk about farming, and many people in this room, poor souls, have had to endure that before, but I often talk about the need for diversity of different scales, different market opportunities, different business models, and the like. And my question for you folks is that just the fact that I have a preference towards diversity? I like the word, and I want to throw it out there, or is there really something fundamental that is either going to add resiliency or make things be more successful if beyond species and crops we are thinking of a diverse array of scales, marketing vehicles, business models, and the like?
Okay. And that's a great question, and one that I've thought about, and a lot of people that I talk with regularly have thought about, is kind of this interaction between diversity and scale. So as you mentioned, the Goranson farm, they have chosen as part of their business model to grow a pretty large number of different products on their farm, and have done so successfully. In many instances, you know, farms have become simpler. They are not as simple as would be portrayed in the media. There would be very few farms that actually produce and sell only a single product or even two products. Most farms have more than that. But all of the data would support the idea that farms have, the number of products produced on individual farms has declined, i.e., individual farms have specialized in certain areas. They maintain a degree of diversity just for exactly the reason you described, which is that it gives them some resilience economically. But the other side of that coin is that it's easier to do a small number of things very well than it is to do a large number of things very well. So farmers are right at the kind of where those two needs meet. You don't want to have a single crop where if you have crop failure, you have no income. But to grow 50 different crops kind of makes you a generalist rather than a specialist. There are very real benefits to being able to specialize on a smaller number of products on your farm. One of the things that I've been interested in is kind of the systems that really I think are troubling are not only where individual farms have become very, very specialized, but then all of the farms in that area specialize in the same thing. So, because then economically it's very fragile, and ecologically it's very fragile. And the kind of classic examples of that in the United States would be, you know, the production of pork in northern Iowa or the production of chicken in the southeast. If you look at these great USDA maps that I use all the time, the degree of concentration in those products in very local geographies causes economic problems and ecological/environmental problems. So I'm interested in how might farms be able to achieve at least a certain degree of specialization so that they can get the benefits that go along with that, but not have the entire agricultural commodity specialize in exactly the same way. So you have diversity on a landscape scale, but some degree of specialization on individual farms, because there is a benefit to doing that. You know, even in kind of our neighborhood in New England, the proportion of agricultural sales in, for example, in the state of Vermont is much more skewed to a single product than it is here in Maine. It's skewed to milk. That, you know, Maine still has a diversity of agricultural products that, but even then we grow potatoes in the county and we have wild blueberries down east, and geographically but maintaining diversity, and you could develop incentives to do this, to have diversity at the landscape scale, but lesser diversity for individual farms because they benefit from that in some ways, not in all ways, but in some ways.
I'm just going to interject. Tim, I'm going to probe you a little bit more. That was great and very useful. What about this idea of diversity of different scales, though? Does it make sense from a standpoint of resiliency or economics to have small farms, large farms, in-between farms all together?
Yes, yeah, it does. And one of the, one of the conversations that gets had in a lot of cases is that an individual or organization or whatever will kind of lock on to one scale and say that, so if you want to talk about efficiency and inputs to output efficiency, then we should just have really big farms because they are really efficient in that, using that definition. And other stakeholders would say that model doesn't work at all, and our goals should be to promote increasing number of small farms. There's, a conflict. Where I sit is I think all scales will continue. They've been skewed to the large and not just on farms. All of those different kind of categories that go along supply chains have also been skewed to the large. And we could make decisions about that to maybe not stop it or totally reverse it, but at least moderate it, so that that isn't always the kind of natural outcome. Business outcome is you have a few really, really big firms or farms. That kind of diversity is good for the economy. And what we've seen, and this came up a couple of times in our conversation already, is the loss of the middle in terms of farms. Is we are seeing smaller farms increasing, at least to some degrees in some parts of the country, and we are seeing a greater proportion of the food supply come from what would be called large farms. And the ones that we're losing, the numbers that are going down, it is the agriculture of the middle. These are households that traditionally would have made most of their income from farming. But those are the kinds of, those are the questions we ask, and do we set specific goals as to trying to moderate some of those influences rather than just saying, let's just let the market decide. Because in many cases, that's going to go to a smaller number of larger entities.
My formal training is in ecology, and one of the seminal papers I read as a graduate student was called Optimal Use of Apache Environment. And optimization, which occurs for a lot of organisms in natural systems, does deal with the kind of landscape as it is, rather than as you would like it to be. And unfortunately, I think that some of the evolution, which relies heavily on the economy of scale, brings us to agribusiness, which in fact can make a lot of money. And I think when things fail, they can fail very catastrophically. The idea that Ireland thought that one strain of potato would work well for them didn't when the blight took off. But the marine parallel, unfortunately, has to do with you have a patchy environment. It's a lot harder for us to see, but the fishermen know about this patchiness. And what we're learning is that a lot of these species can actually complete their life cycle in a much smaller space than we used to think, including species like codfish. They have spawning aggregations, and they have feeding grounds. And if any of you haven't, you should read Jared Diamond's book, Collapse, because he talks about civilizations that have had greater longevity and those that didn't. And when he talked about the marine realm, he talked about the people in Oceania who live close to their environment understand how it's changing and adapt to that. But the coastal communities that collapsed were where they had kings or leaders who were distant from that. And the modern parallel has to do with how fishing vessels consolidate to larger and larger fishing vessels. I work in Norway, and I can remember my Norwegian colleagues saying, we used to be a country of fishing vessels, now we're a country of overfishing vessels. And this consolidation, which we have transferable quotas so that it can become, from a business plan, better to have these large vessels with big capacity. And if you read or saw The Perfect Storm, you know that basically, the fishermen had to go out to the Flemish Cap because they didn't make their quota. It was the person who owned the boat that told them to go back out. And I think that this is the least optimal way to use a patchy environment. I think the smaller vessels, the ones that are more responsive, can actually deal on a landscape scale with the kind of diversity that exists rather than what you would want it to be.
You can clap. It's really hard to follow these two because they kind of cover a lot of what I would say, but and a lot more. But I guess I would just say that, you know, I think it's clear that on different scales, different businesses on different scales have the opportunity to do different things. You know, they can take advantage of different things. And so I think that it is good to have various scales, but I do think that we could be thinking more about how, when we scale things up, do we not lose some of the best things about you know, a smaller scale model where we can see exactly what the impacts are, or most of the impacts of what we're doing. Once we get to a certain scale and externalities become sort of invisible, I think that's when it becomes problematic. So to the degree that we can be thinking about how we scale things up in a way, or how larger scale things actually can operate in a more a way that's more conscious of those effects, I think we could do better there.
I want to do a time check with Jody. Should we go forward? Yes. Okay. So my question, I want to throw out a question about money and investment for us all to think about, because it fits right in with what we're talking about. And one of the things I would say is that, you know, the different scale businesses in the fish business, and I think it's true for ag as well, as Amanda said earlier, that that dairy and lobster both have to get rid of a perishable product. And I was taught by a fish dealer in Portland, between chews on his cigar, that everyone needs an undertaker. And you know, when you're harvesting a crop and it's harvest time, you've got a whole lot of it, and you've got to have it someplace to get rid of it. And I think the bigger scale organizations often, or you know, entities make that possible. We've seen in fisheries that fisheries management back in the 70s, there was a distinct decision that I witnessed, that fisheries regulation was going to always benefit the people who were full-time scallopers or full-time groundfish fishermen, as opposed to people who were part-time, because obviously they were less dependent on it, so-called. And so you have a system where when people want to invest, they want to be able to produce some kind of consistent stream of a consistent product at predictable times. And what that's led us to is pulse fishing or large farming. And the business system itself hasn't been able to accommodate the type of harvesting Apache environment. So as we now look at the interest in investing in aquaculture, I have the same question. How do we integrate the use of this patchy environment with the production of additional food through culture techniques that is not harming the basic producing thing, and is actually fitting in with the business system? And I don't think this is a simple question, but I think if we ask the question, we might come up with some business models. We might be a little bit less quick to rush to investing in something that is not actually thought through.
Boy, there's an awful lot to unpack there, and but I do think that there are, from the marine realm, there are ways of harvesting that is good for one species, but very damaging to others. So that dragging and trawling, it flattens the sea floor, and as a matter of fact, some of that flattening is reducing the nursery habitat for other species. It's also resuspending a lot of sediment, and that sediment is often very harmful to other species. And so if the community could get together and come up with best use practices so that all the ships in the harbor would rise, it would be a better thing. In other words, reducing your efficiency of harvest, but being able to maintain several other species under that condition would be, I think, a better way to go forward. And again, I think this is a matter of, Maine has a tradition of town meetings, and communities and co-ops do a lot of coordinating. And so there is a natural behavior in the marine realm to do a fair amount of this. And in fact, it's interesting that some of the fishermen, lobstermen may also be dragging for something else. And this is a dilemma that has to be dealt with sometimes, a personal one where, gee, I don't think I want to trawl there because that's actually my sweet spot. So there is that, and then of course there's always this tragedy of the commons in the sense that if you're a farmer, you have to make some of these same kind of decisions. You may have to, till an area differently for one crop, and it may not be as good for another crop. But when you're talking about the marine realm, where anybody could fish that area, you have to move forward with a type of consensus that this is a practice that everybody's going to embrace. And how we can move towards that, coming up with multiple interests, multiple use, I think that's incredibly challenging. And I think I danced around and didn't even get close to answering Robin's question, but it makes my brain hurt.
I want to maybe just go a little different direction on this idea of investment. And it kind of relates to the issue that, John, you raised in your last question around scale, because there is interest in making essentially investments in the food system that would be for those functions on farms that you really need to be at a certain scale to be able to do them as an individual farm. And one of the areas that we've talked about a lot in my program is, and I've been in a number of conversations around New England about this, is kind of what's the first critical activity that needs to be able to take place for a set of products. So if you look at things like fruits and vegetables, those of you that are familiar with it, you need a way to cool that. You may need a way to freeze it, or at least minimally process it. And to be able to do that on an individual farm, you need to be at some scale, maybe across a range of crops. So it wouldn't have to be, I have to have X number of acres of just this one, but they would be similar enough. And there is interest in not farms doing that, but businesses that provide that essentially as a service, so that because the alternative is that the production, that system just continues to go down that road of the way to do it is to be a bigger farm. If you're going to carry out all of the functions, let's say all the way out to packing or shipping or cooling or freezing, you'd have to be a decent sized operation to be able to do that. So I've had some discussion with investment groups about making strategic investments. One of the points that I keep making to that is we should also be strategic about where those are located, specifically, like spatially, geographically, where are they located. But I'm really interested, and I'd love to hear other people's thoughts about it, about what are creative ways to think about that so that small to medium-sized farms can essentially experience some of the benefits of economies of scale without all of them just becoming big farms.
Question that I want to make sure we pick back up. We're going to take a break because you've been sitting a long time, and we're going to come back in 10 minutes. What did I do with my watch? At 3:15, we'll reconvene, and what I'm hoping you'll do over the next 10 minutes is think about questions that you've been sitting on for the last hour and a half or 2 hours, we, as I say, we had a laundry list of questions that we came up with ourselves so we can launch into that. But what I really want to do is we will be seating all of these individuals in the tables and think about what you want to be talking about when we get back, and we'll make sure that we address as many of those issues as possible in the next hour and a half. So thanks.
What I should have gotten into is the process.